On the banks of the Euphrates, something is changing. Villages that have existed for millennia are beginning to grow uncontrollably. People are arriving. Many people. More than the land can absorb. More than the ancient structures can organize. And at the center of this transformation, a village called Uruk is about to cross a point of no return. Because when thousands of human beings concentrate in the same space, something breaks. Old rules cease to function. And what emerges in its place is not just a larger village, it is something completely new. But then around 3500 BC, Uruk crossed that threshold. And for the first time in human history, a city was born. Not an expanded village, not a permanent encampment. A city, an urban organism with tens of thousands of inhabitants living simultaneously within monumental walls, organized by systems that had never existed before. And what happens in Uruk in the following centuries is not just the birth of a metropolis, it is the invention of urban civilization. Because Uruk is not an accident, it is the inevitable solution to a problem that humanity had never faced: how to make thousands of strangers live together without everything collapsing. This episode will show how Uruk reorganized human existence, how it transformed peasants into citizens, villages into hierarchies, and oral memory into writing, and how, in doing so, it established the model for all the cities that would come after. Because when you understand Uruk, you understand the exact moment when humanity ceased to be a rural species and became an urban species. The story begins with a problem of scale. For millennia, Mesopotamian villages functioned with a few hundred inhabitants. Everyone knew each other. Decisions were made in assemblies. Conflicts were resolved face to face. Agricultural production was distributed among families. There was no need for written rules because everyone knew who was who. But then, around 4000 BC, irrigated agriculture. In Euphrates, Mesopotamia became absurdly productive. Canals brought water from the rivers, harvests increased, and with them, the population. And the problem is that when a village grew from 500 to 5,000 people, the entire system collapsed. Because in a village of 500 people, you know everyone. In a city of 5,000, you know nobody. And Uruk surpasses that. Around 3200 BC, Uruk had between 40 and 50,000 inhabitants. It was the largest human concentration that ever existed. And at that moment, the first urban dilemma in history arose: how to get tens of thousands of strangers to cooperate without destroying each other. Uruk's response is the creation of three simultaneous inventions. First, the permanent hierarchy. Second, the administrative bureaucracy. Third, writing. And these three inventions are deeply connected. Because when you can no longer rely on collective memory, you need records. When you can no longer resolve everything in assembly, you need experts. And when you have experts, you need authority. From this point on, the city is no longer a community. It is a system. And the physical symbol of this is the White Temple, a monumental structure erected on a raised platform 15 meters high in the heart of Uruk. The White Temple is not just a place of worship. It is the administrative center of the city. It is where the priest administrators control the flow of grain, organize collective work, record debts, and distribute rations. And it is from within this temple that cuneiform writing emerges, because writing is not born to tell stories. It is born to control stocks. Imagine you are a peasant who has just arrived in Uruk. You come from a village in the countryside where you knew everyone by name. Now you are inside walls that stretch for 9 kilometers. Before you, tens of thousands of people you have never seen before. Noisy markets where products you don't recognize are traded. Gigantic temples where priests wear robes that indicate an authority you don't fully understand. And at the end of the month, you must hand over part of your harvest to an official who records the transaction on a clay tablet. You can't read what's written, but you know it's a contract, and that if you don't comply, there will be consequences. You have just entered bureaucratic civilization. But this opens the door to something unexpected, because Uruk doesn't grow solely through migration. It grows because it reorganizes labor. In the villages, everyone does everything. In Uruk, total specialization emerges. Some build, others weave, others produce pottery, others administer. And for the first time, there are people who don't produce food. Priests, scribes, artisans, soldiers. These people depend entirely on the redistribution system controlled by the temple, and the price of this becomes apparent when you realize that Uruk can no longer go back. The city has created a population that can only survive within it. If the system collapses, thousands will die. And then came writing, not as art, not as philosophy, as an accounting tool. The earliest cuneiform tablets found in Uruk don't contain epics. They contain lists: 62 sacks of barley, 15 sheep, 8 jars of oil. The scribe marks the damp clay with a reed stylus. The symbols are simple, abstract pictograms representing concrete objects. And this invention changes everything, because now memory is outside the human mind. Now you can record the past, project the future, and collect debts from people you've never seen. We gained permanence, but we pay with control. But here's the twist. At first glance, Uruk appears to have been planned. The temples are monumental. The walls follow a geometric layout. The distribution of grain is coordinated. Everything suggests a central mind that designed the city. But in reality, Uruk wasn't planned. It was inevitable. Because what happens in Uruk isn't a political project. It's an emergent response to a problem of density. When thousands of people concentrate, hierarchical organization isn't a choice. It's the only way to avoid chaos. And that's why Uruk subsequently becomes the model. Because other cities realize that the system works. Imagine you are a temple administrator. Every day, hundreds of workers come to receive their rations. You need to know who worked, how much they produced, and what they should receive. Without writing, this is impossible. So you take a fresh clay tablet. You mark the symbols. You dry it in the sun. You store it in a file. And suddenly you have institutional memory. You can verify what was promised months ago. You can detect fraud. You can plan future harvests. And you realize that writing is not just a record. It is power. Because whoever controls the tablets controls the agreed-upon reality. And the impact of this expands. Around 3000 BC, other cities begin to emerge in Mesopotamia. Ur, Eridu, Lagash, Nippur. They all follow the model of Uruk. Central temples, walls, writing, hierarchy. Because Uruk proved that it was possible to organize tens of thousands of people without everything collapsing. And the central mechanism is always the same. Concentrate resources, specialize labor, record transactions, and create a permanent administrative class. But Uruk also pays a price, because when you concentrate power, you create structural inequality. The priests live in the temple, the artisans live in specific neighborhoods, the peasants live on the outskirts, and this division is not temporary, it's architectural. The city is physically organized to separate those who command from those who obey. And for the first time in history, something that never existed in villages emerges: urban poverty. Because in the villages, everyone had access to land. In Uruk, thousands of people depend on rations distributed by the temple. If you lose access, you starve to death in a city surrounded by fertile fields. And then another central artifact appears: the cylinder seals. Small stone cylinders engraved with images and symbols. When you roll them on damp clay, they leave a unique mark, and these marks function as signatures, as certificates of ownership, as guarantees of authenticity. Imagine you are a merchant. You trade grain with someone you have never seen. But if the tablet has the temple seal, you know the transaction is legitimate. And suddenly, trust no longer depends on knowing the person. It depends on recognizing the symbol. When the seal replaces the face, you have an impersonal economy, and the system spreads, because Uruk is not an isolated case. It is the first in a series. Over the next few centuries, urbanization expands throughout the Fertile Crescent. Cities spring up in Egypt, in India, in China, and all of them, regardless of distance, develop the same basic mechanisms: writing, hierarchy, temples, walls, because the city is not a cultural invention, it is a structural solution. And when you face the problem of organizing thousands of people, the solutions converge. But Uruk also reveals a profound paradox. The city promises security, walls against invaders, granaries against famine, temples against uncertainty. But to guarantee this security, you need to accept control. You need to pay taxes, follow rules, obey authorities, work on collective projects you didn't choose, and you realize that the freedom of the villages has been exchanged for the stability of the cities. We gained civilization, but we paid with autonomy, and perhaps the most symbolic artifact of Uruk is the walls themselves, 9 kilometers long, built with baked clay bricks, thick enough to allow chariots to pass over them. These walls are not just defense, they are a psychological border, because inside them you are protected, but you are also trapped. And for the first time, humanity must choose between being inside or outside, between being a citizen or an outsider, between belonging to the system or living on its margins. And then around 2800 BC, writing evolved. Pictograms became abstract signs. Cuneiform could now record not only objects but sounds, ideas, laws, stories, and from that moment on, human memory multiplied, because now you could transmit knowledge without speaking. You could teach people you had never seen. You could preserve wisdom beyond the life of its creator, and you realized that writing was not just an administrative tool, it was the technology that allowed civilization to accumulate. In the end, Uruk shows us the fundamental compromise of urban life. To live in cities, we need to accept intermediaries, accept that we won't know everyone, accept that our decisions will be made by experts we'll never see, accept that individual freedom will be limited by collective necessity. And in return, we gain scale, we gain art, we gain science, we gain literature, we gain all the achievements that are only possible when thousands of minds cooperate. The city is not a cage, but it's not freedom either. It's a pact, and Uruk was the first place where humanity signed that pact. Because what was born in Uruk wasn't just a city, it was the organizational model that still governs billions of people today. Hierarchy, bureaucracy, writing, specialization, all of that emerged there. And when you look at Uruk, you're not looking at the distant past. You're looking at the moment when urban civilization began. And you realize that the dilemmas Uruk faced are still our dilemmas. How to organize crowds, how to distribute resources, how to balance order and freedom, how to make strangers trust each other. Uruk didn't solve these questions, but it was the first city to ask them. And then, writing spreads. Because once you invent a way to store memory outside the mind, there's no going back. And future generations will use this tool to build empires, write laws, and preserve stories that will span millennia. If you want to continue exploring how major historical transformations have shaped humanity's daily life, subscribe to the channel. Each episode reconstructs a pivotal moment in history with visual and narrative rigor.